Hello, today I'm going to be presenting on nuclear economics, particularly focusing on the investment side of nuclear utilities, how capital investments are managed, how some of the tax strategies work, that kind of thing, how consumer costs are kept low. So we'll jump right into it. So I'm going to go briefly over the financial characteristics for utilities. If we were to look back several decades ago, in a period before, before the 1970s, the government, at least in the U.S., realized having multiple utilities, or rather duplicate utilities and transmission utilities and services, that kind of thing, it was sort of a disservice to consumers because you're developing more infrastructure than you need to reliably deliver power or electricity to your customers. So this new strategy was adopted in the 1970s called the one utility per region strategy. This essentially removed redundancy, and as a result, it monopolized companies in their particular regions. With that sort of mandated monopoly, you also had higher expectations for these utilities, obligations to the public. So those can be condensed into three main points. The first being they had to operate within the regulatory constraints that applied on all levels. So you have the federal level, the state level, and then of course the local level. Utilities also had to expand to meet the growth of its service area, and it always had to render service when demanded. Um, and also utilities had to stay aware of any technical developments. This could be new research developments or new optimization in that particular field. Maybe something new came up in like hydroelectric generation or some new exotic nuclear fuels discovered. Those utilities would have to be aware and at least make an effort to incorporate those in their generation. Again, to keep costs low to consumers. So talking a little bit about the financial structure, um, by 2011, so we're jumping up ahead a little bit, some states had been completely deregulated in terms of electric utilities. This sort of deregulation, which was going on for a couple decades prior, allowed consumers to have more of a say in where they got their energy. There's more of a choice, I guess. If you had companies that focused more on renewables or companies that focused on lower costs, maybe there are some sacrifices that came with that. Either way, consumers would have multiple options. So of course, this increases competition in a free market, which of course adds to a healthier economy. So 19 states were deregulated in 2011, and that number has been updated to 26 states as of this year. So we're now over half of all existing states. That number is expected to rise over time. So now, utility companies can be private, public, cooperatives, which means shared equity among its sort of users. I mean, everyone has sort of an equal vote, I guess, in the direction of the company. And then nationalized, which would be government controlled. So four main types. And then to raise money, utilities, this is of course prior to generating electricity. When they're just starting out, utilities often go to venture capitalists or maybe even angel investors to offer stocks and bonds. The ratio of stocks to bonds is usually around one. This is actually sort of a unique thing in the electric utility industry due to proven financial stability, right? Because electricity is always going to be in demand. It's sort of something that stands stands the test of recessions and poor economic um, um, dips, I guess. You have that constant stability, mostly constant stability. So stocks and bonds are offered at sort of that ratio as a result. This poses a lesser risk to investors. There's always going to be investors looking into utilities. It's often a safe investment, and this likewise ensures relatively easy access to funding for those respective utilities. Some extra, I guess, interesting bits of info. For manufacturing companies, the ratio of their net worth to revenue is often less than 1, but when you look at electric utilities, that's nearly a factor of 3. Costs for electric utilities are divided into different distributions. So you have about 60% generation, 10% transmission, and if you remember, since deregulation, since that sort of unification, or like one utility per region policy, transmission lines and transmission services have been sort of unified, which means those costs are kept relatively low. So that 10% transmission is going to remain relatively stable and may even drop over time. And then you've got the remaining 30%, which goes into distribution. So talking about sort of cash flow, I know my camera is covering part of this diagram. Down here in this sort of region is there. I think there's only one node down here, and you can verify in the book as well, one main node, and that is sort of the net profit that an electric utility will end up with. So up here in the top, you have total revenue from customers, paying customers. This is coming down. Obviously, the first critical deductions are fuel, property tax, and operation and management. Very critical parts to keeping the utility going. After that, the remainder of the cash is separated amongst a variety of nodes, those being notably debt returns, federal taxes. You're paying off your investors who are invested in your stocks and your bonds. And after all of that has been processed, then you have your net profit. And all of this on the left side sort of summarizes that. So talking about the electric utility regulatory history, and I'll get more into the nuclear side here in a bit. So from 1935 to 78, investor-owned electric utilities operated under the Public Utility Holding Act, which was set in 1935. So this gave complete federal control and jurisdiction in regards to like wholesale power and interstate transmission services. It's important to note, especially in 1935, nuclear energy was not, or I should say civilian nuclear energy was not a thing. It simply did not exist. Some aspects of nuclear science were being explored. Of course, we got the bombs first, but nuclear electricity was not conceived at this time. It's important to note. So in 1978, this is of course after several reactors have been developed. You have PURPA, the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act. This was passed and required utilities to buy power from NUGs, non-utility generating facilities. So this was sort of an act to inspire people to look towards more renewable sources and also diversifying sources. So as you can see here, NUG specialize in renewable energy, versatile generation as well, which would include steam both for electricity and for heating. This sort of enactment was poorly handled, resulting in unnecessary long-term contracts that these utilities had to sign. They were paying above market rates for electricity, and this eventually harmed consumers, and still in a way harms consumers in the long run. So in 1992, the Energy Policy Act was passed. This brought in exemptions for some of those NUGs. This led to expanding growth of those and increased energy competition. And I do apologize, this is cutting off part of the slide. Anyways, okay. So getting into the special features of nuclear fuel, there are some important things to keep in mind. Nuclear fuel is always purchased as a compound, right? Run through multiple processes, enrichment, conversion, storage, and that's all before electricity generation takes place. Whereas fossil fuels remain generally static. There's not a lot of reprocessing or a lot of upfront costs that has to go into maintaining those fuels. There's a significant costs incurred by fuel before generation even starts because of those sorts of preset processes you have to go through. Fuel remains on utility ledgers for years even after use. Fuel is considered a capital asset. Also, unlike other fuels, nuclear fuel incurs a storage cost after use. If you think about other fuels, they're either being burned up or used and then released into the environment. They don't pose as great of a risk to nuclear fuel, which has to be closely monitored over time. So that also adds to the overall cost. Also, the interesting thing is the salvage value of nuclear fuel is negative. In fact, the federal government charges on average about, I think that's 1/10 of a cent per kilowatt hour. So yeah, all of these factors do add up, making nuclear fuel a bit less cost competitive. And of course, many companies, pretty much every nuclear company, especially the ones that are focusing on advanced reactors, are making that one of their main selling points, which is cost competition, because that has been a long time sort of drawback when it comes to nuclear energy. So the investment in fuel over time. So if you were to, okay, so yeah, this graph, again, this comes from the Nuclear Fuel Cycle book. I believe it's section 8.4. If we were to track the net worth of fuel, how much it's worth at which particular stage, you'd see it approximates sort of this like little mountain, I guess. It's a gradual curve upward, or rather, it's kind of like a stair pattern. You have conversion that instantly makes it more valuable, enrichment to increase the U-235 concentration that instantly adds value, fabrication into fuel pellets that also instantly adds value. Right here you've got startup, and then after a long period of gradual fuel burnup, that value depreciates, and then it's relatively stable after you put it in long-term storage. So there is a strategy that utilities will take, which is leasing nuclear fuel. Of course, buying nuclear fuel outright is always an option, but leasing is sort of an attractive alternative for a variety of reasons. The way this works is usually a trust company will be set up, sort of a not really a duplicate company, but a sister company. This finances 100% of the fuel cost to that utility. The utility will lay out its requirements for the fuel to the leasing company. They say we need this fuel at this particular time because we're set to go online at this particular time. The fuel needs to have these characteristics. It needs to, I don't know, there's a bunch of deadlines. There are plenty of requirements that the utility will make to the leasing company. And then upon startup, the utility will then begin making payments back to the leasing company. And this is where sort of the magic happens. The payments are directly proportional to the power output of the core. So if a utility is set to generate at a constant power output for a certain period of time, those payments are going to be also constant. If it's staggered, maybe power output is going to peak at a certain time, then payments will also peak at that specific time as well. Directly proportional. This deferring of payments helps keep costs relatively low to consumers, because if utilities don't have to pay for all of the fuel directly up front, fuel of course can be very expensive, then you don't have to immediately place that burden on consumers. You can offer them lower prices initially. So the cost of leasing is also shown on the ledger, usually as an operating expense on the part of the utility. There's one major risk, I guess, that comes with this sort of strategy. and this is true for any sort of loan. If a utility has to stop energy production for any reason, say there's failure, some external circumstance, it's still going to have to pay off that debt. There's no forgiveness. I mean, there may be some sort of forgiveness structure, but generally the utility will still be obligated to keep its end of the deal and make those payments. So this graph, which is also taken from the book, shows the debt profile for leased nuclear fuel. You see here you have an even point, a wide separation in debt to costs being paid, and then another break-even point up here. So with the debt, you have a similar, sort of a similar relationship as was seen with the net worth of fuel. So you start with your raw uranium oxide, it's going through conversion, through enrichment, through fuel fabrication. This is where you're taking on the most debt, but it's also where you begin producing power. And you can see these sort of pillars represent those flat, constant payments that are going to be made, which will eventually become equal to the debt that was incurred, and you've officially broken even and kept costs low for your consumers. So it's a win-win for everyone involved. So cost components for nuclear electricity generation. Traditionally, costs and construction times for nuclear energy have been pretty high. Labor, just to go quickly through these because I know I'm kind of going pretty far on time here. Labor 10%, equipment and materials 5%, proven design 3%, novel design 20%, which is insanely high, extrapolated design 5%. So this poses sort of a problem for advanced nuclear companies, especially those in sort of the SMR space, because guess what? This is where most of their costs are going, 20%, for their novel designs, the designs that no one's really ever thought of before. Some SMR companies are taking on extrapolated designs, taking on designs from several decades ago and simply improving them, miniaturizing them, that sort of thing, which certainly helps to keep costs low because there's a bit more of a proof of concept behind it, and you don't have to deal with as many fees, as many NRC communications in getting your design approved, which is certainly nice to have, especially since approval can take upwards of a decade or even longer, several years at least. Further costs, operation and management, maintenance, lies at the low end of the spectrum. Advanced reactors run for the most part autonomously with enough passive safety features, those engineering safety features that you've probably studied before. Of course, reactors are only getting more and more passive, more and more self-controlled, so this O&M factor is certainly going to decrease over time, or at least we would expect it to. Fuel, of course, is always going to assume a large majority of the cost. You can see 30% of total generating costs for a plant with near zero capital costs. This likely won't change because fuel is always going to be expensive. Uranium is rare. Thorium is really any sort of fuel is going to be rare. It's going to take some time, plenty of energy and effort to extract and process, and that will likely be standard for a while. Taxes, of course, are also standard. NRC costs, again, design and licensing applications can hit 7 figures. You can check on the NRC's site. They give out guidelines for their applications, and often the fees do jump up into those 7 figures pretty quickly. This is all before any sort of construction as well, so this makes it critical for startups to obtain early capital as fast as possible. Further costs may also be paid towards government entities for amending their license, or if, say, for example, a utility needs to renew their fuel or ship in new fuel, that also needs to be licensed, which also adds to the overall cost. So that's, again, a brief overview of the economics that nuclear utilities have to work through. and then sources here, use the book, and then just some quick facts that I got from this website. So yeah, thank you for watching.